Obviously Afghanistan was like right in our faces. And obviously Haiti's been on our radar for a while, through their broken government, but now natural disaster. And there's just so much turmoil over there. And then Lebanon, which didn't get as much, news attention, but still really horrific things happening there. And it was right in our faces. And, I've always been encouraged to not go political. Especially from people I respect, saying, the pulpit, that's not for politics. And I agree. During the election cycle, you did not hear me promoting a candidate. My encouragement to you all was, before you look left and before you look right, look up. Right? Like, set your gaze straight first before you enter into that polling booth. And so we're never going to make this a pulpit where I'm candidating for somebody. But I was upset this week. This isn't political. I was upset at our commander-in-chief. I felt like the ball was dropped. I was upset that it seemed to be poor planning. When you see our military weapons being used by the Taliban, you see our Humvees moving through the streets, and you just think the ball got dropped. And I got upset. But it was as I was reading and reminding myself of the book of Acts, of who's really in control here. As I vividly remember sitting down this week, and I remember saying, all right, President Biden, you got to do something. You got to fix this. And I started beginning to think, okay, if he doesn't, what are the world leaders going to? Because this is outrageous of what's happening. Somebody's got to intervene. Somebody's got to help these women. They're just being murdered. These Christians that, if you're a Christian, you have a Bible on your phone, you get erased. And something, and man, somebody's got to do something. But you look through the book of Acts, you see mass persecution happening. And you don't see relief coming from government officials. You don't see other world leaders getting involved and saying, we're going to fix this. And so I just began thinking, okay, God, you're in control here. And you can fix this any way that you want to. And God may use President Biden. God may use the UN. He might use other world leaders to come in and intervene and fix the situation. But then I started thinking, okay, what if God does something that he's done historically and shown up and saved the ruler of the persecution? Do we forget Saul of Tarsus already? Did we forget what he was doing? Did we forget that he was imprisoning Christians for being Christians? That he got wind of that things were happening around the world, and so he made it his mission to go around and squash this thing? And then God shows up in this beautiful moment. He blinds him and he throws him off of a horse and he says, hey, you're done doing this. I'm in charge. You're following me now. And that's been my prayer this week. Like, God, you can do anything that you want to. You could use world leaders. You could use our military. And he might still do that. But God, if there's a solution to this problem, and one of the solutions is that all the Taliban get saved, that's what I'm rooting for. That's what I'm asking for. Like God, change their hearts. I know you can do it. I'm not a naive 27-year-old. I know it's out there. I know that the whole Taliban getting saved and giving themselves to Jesus is unlikely. But I know my God can do anything. And we talked about that last week, a God who can save anybody. That we went into Philippi and we saw all these different, he can save this demon-possessed slave girl. And he could radically show that he's got power over the powers of darkness and Satan. And he triumphed. And this woman who had everything and she thought nothing could be added to her life, Lydia, he says, no, you need me to satisfy your soul. And the rough and tough people, this ex-GI soldier, he says, I'm going to save you too, and your whole family. And this is how we're going to birth that church. And so this week, I've just been reminded, I'm looking at all the crises in the world, and I'm not placing my hope in Washington. I'm not placing my hope in other world leaders to fix this, but I'm placing my hope in God, and I know that he can. Again, this isn't political. I've never wanted us to embrace the elephant or the donkey, but the lion and the lamb. Right? Those are, if we're going to embody an animal, those are the animals, the lion of lamb. We want to be fierce. We want to be strong. We don't want to be cowards. We're not going to shy away and be passive in culture and society, but we're going to be gentle as a lamb. And so I wanted to share some of my frustration, but I also wanted to share where I've been placing my hope this week. And throughout the Bible, we just see vast persecution enter in, and we see God bring good from it. We see God do things that nobody would have planned or nobody would have chosen and nobody would have figured out, but God was working throughout all of history. And so we have Saul of Tarsus, this beautiful example that, hey, you know what? Though things are going real rigid here, God hasn't forgotten. God knows God has a plan. And so we know we don't serve a God who's incapable of saving the worst of humanity. And so as you watch the news this week, going forward, my encouragement is pray. Stop and pray. Pray for our brothers and sisters who are enduring great suffering, unimaginable suffering, persecution for being Christian. Pray for the persecutors, that their eyes would be opened, that their hearts would be transformed. Pray for our leaders who have to make a lot of these decisions. I make decisions and I can't even please 100 people. I can't imagine 330 million or whatever it is that we have in our country. So I don't envy the decision making, but we can pray for our leaders. We're commanded to, and that God will bring real transformation. Last week, we talked about 3 separate encounters in Acts 16. And then in Acts 17, we got 3 new encounters. Not encounters with people. Well, yes, technically, but encounters with cities. That Paul goes to 3 separate cities. And what we saw last week was that how diverse, how different these people were. You had Lydia rich, you had the slave girl poor, and you had a blue-collar jailer. It was just this diverse group of people that Paul encounters and he ministers with. And then he goes to 3 separate cities in Acts 17. And he preaches that life-saving message that he's seen transcend socioeconomic status, gender, racial, all this stuff. It transcended all of it. And we saw people believe, and it wasn't because of all these other things. And this week we see that same message, the same message that can transcend, but has 3 separate responses. It's the same message he's preaching, but the cities react very differently to the message. On the one hand, one of the cities, they resulted with anger. They react with anger. They start a riot. They want a fist fight, if you will. And then you have another city that responds and reacts with questioning. Where Paul's going to come in, he's going to bring the gospel, and they're going to say, hey, tell us more about that. We want more clarity. You're saying some things we've never heard before. And then on the third reaction that we'll see in our text this morning is that people respond with lives changed forever. And so we have been called to go into the world, into all these different places, and we got one message. And sure, there's different cultures and there'll be different methods that people use to share the gospel. At the end of the day, it's the same message. But I want us to show how people will react differently to the message that we have for them. And so we'll see that in our text this morning. In our world today, we see the gospel going to Africa. We see it going to America. We see it going to Asia. And yet, people respond very differently. But the means of salvation is still the same. By grace through faith. And so if the New York broker, gives their life to Christ, it's going to be because of grace through faith. If we have a Taliban leader give their life to Christ, it's going to be the same way. By grace through faith. The message of Jesus was that it was done for you, and that belief in him results in reconciliation to God. And so this is exciting. That we have the front row seat to these different responses. And I'm sure many of you in here, you've had different responses. Maybe you've been a part of somebody's spiritual journey where that person did not know anything about Jesus. and you got to encounter them, and you got to be able to just witness to them and talk about your life and share life with them and ultimately disciple them to the way of the foot of the cross. If you've been a part of that before, that's something really cool. To be able to say, hey, I saw this person and they didn't want anything to do with Jesus, but by the end, they're surrendering, they're giving their lives to Jesus. I've seen it happen, and it's beautiful. But maybe some of you in here, you shared this life-saving message of Jesus. You shared how it's transformed your life. You shared, hey, I want you to experience what I've experienced. I want you to have transformation. And you experience everything other than conversion. Right? Maybe you've experienced anger, like maybe you got cussed out. Hey, don't talk to me about this. I'm a good person. And you experienced, every emotion under the sun. Right? Like, look, don't talk to me. I'm good. Or I believe what I believe and you believe what you believe. Let's just go our separate ways. And maybe that's the response that you received, and nothing about your method or your message changed, but it's just the way that it fell on the ears and the hearts of the people. You see, we're not called to make decisions for people. I can't make anybody in here make any decision. I wish that I could, but I can't. I'm limited in my abilities. I can read, I can talk, and my ability is probably about stop there. And I started too heavy this morning. Y'all, that was pretty funny. And I think you're all just still soaking in that 10-minute intro. So, no, I know that we're not responsible for people's decisions. That we can be faithful ministers of the gospel, that we can present. But at the end of the day, people are going to make their own decisions. And so our call is just to be faithful evangelists, be faithful ambassadors of Jesus. And like we saw last week, unique, very, very, very different individual encounters. And this week, 3 different responses. The same message, the same gospel, and yet 3 different responses. Paul and company now have moved on from Philippi. That's where he was last week. We talked about this was the second missionary journey. This is where he was going to ruffle the most feathers, get in the most hot water. This was going to be pretty dangerous stuff. And so now he's moved from Philippi and he's gone to Thessalonica. If you're not familiar with Thessalonica, maybe the name sounds familiar. Paul wrote a 2-part volume set to these people, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And then from there, we see kind of a riot take place, and so Paul has to dip, and he goes to Berea. And maybe you've heard that word Bereans before. Bereans, they have their own denomination. There's a Bereans study Bible, and these people, they consume the word. They love the word. They loved Paul's coming to them. And then lastly, we have a city that if you weren't familiar with the first 2, I'm sure you're familiar with this name, Athens. Paul makes it to Athens, and there's going to be a really powerful story there. If you're not familiar with Athens, it's where Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato, some of the greatest philosophers that our world has ever seen have come from there. The Olympics started there. Kind of a monumental place, if you will. And so 3 different places, 3 different responses. One's anger, one's life change, and one's with questions. And so I want us to start by looking at Acts chapter 17. We're going to look at the first 9 verses. Now, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, on the 3rd Sabbath day. He reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out of the crowd. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, these men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. And Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there's another king, Jesus. And the people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. And when they had taken the money as a security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. And so Paul comes to Thessalonica. It's about a 3-day journey from Philippi. And Thessalonica was a really important port city. This is where a lot of commerce was happening. A lot of business was taking place. Life was moving here. And so Paul shows up. And what does he do? As it was his custom, he shows up to the synagogue and he begins to reason and teach the scriptures. Right? This was not uncommon for Paul, but it says that he explained and reasoned the scriptures to these people. That word reasoned literally means to make sense of. So what was Paul trying to make sense of? Well, it shows kind of in our text, but it says that he was showing Christ in the Old Testament. He was teaching the necessity for Christ to suffer all these things. And what he's doing is he's coming onto their playground. He says, hey, I want to witness this great gospel to you. And so how I'm going to do that is I'm going to meet you where you're at. Hey, you study all these scriptures. You know them inside and out. And hey, that whole Messiah thing, that one that was going to come, I know that we thought he was going to build this kingdom right here on earth, and then he was going to rule and reign, and he was going to save Israel, and he was going to be our king, and we were going to be his people, and it's going to be a great time here on the earth. It's about that. So it wasn't actually an earthly kingdom. You see how our brother Isaiah used to write how he was going to be a suffering servant, that he was going to be a man of sorrows, that he's going to be rejected by men. That was our king. His name was Jesus. And we were the ones that rejected him. We fulfilled that prophecy. And so he's being able to just say, hey, I'm trying to clarify you, those scriptures that you're reading. Jesus was the one. He was the one, and you need to give your lives to him. And so he was able to go in and into the synagogue and reason. And what I love about this, I said, he met them on their playground. Because Paul ministers actually a little bit differently in these 3 interactions. Similarly, he does in Berea. But Athens, next week when we get into the sermon on Mars Hill, Paul don't use scripture. Paul doesn't quote Old Testament scripture in that sermon. But here he's meeting these people where they're at. He's saying, hey, I have a bridge here where we can, have some commonality. I always want to be careful, because I have a very diverse Christian background. Very diverse. But there have been times that I've been a part of, whether it be because of my high school, really fundamentalist, kind of legalistic church, Christianity. And one of the things that my biggest gripe was always how it was made to be that, hey, we're holy, and we're different from the world. And because we're different, we dress this way, we talk this way, we look this way, we act this way. And this is how it means to be different. That's not what the Bible's talking about when it's saying being holy. At all. To be separate, to be set apart, doesn't mean to be weird. Can I shoot straight with you? I know the world thinks we're weird, but we don't need to be. You know how we've been called to be different? You know how we've been called to be set apart? Well, when I preached the message on Phos, what the word Phos means, I went to Philippians chapter 2. And it says, do all things without grumbling or complaining, so that what? You may shine as a light in a dark and crooked generation, that you would be different. How do you be different? Do all things without grumbling or complaining. And it seemed anticlimactic until you try it. Right? And so we've been called to be different in the way we love, in the way we serve, in the way we conduct ourselves. But all this other stuff that alienates us from people. This is totally sidebar, it's totally free this morning. But I think about when Paul says, I've become all things to all people, that by any means I might save some. I love how that fleshes out in his ministry. That to the Jew, he's going to become the most Jewish guy in the world. I'm going to talk with all the Jewish lingo so I can have a moment with you. To the Greek, I'm going to become really Greek. I'm going to be really casual. To the poor, I'm going to become really poor. To the rich, I become rich. He's become all things to all people. He meets people where they're at, and we see it right here in Acts 17, that he's coming in and he's reasoning with these Jews from their own scriptures. He's saying, okay, I'll play ball with you. I'll do it on your side of things. And then we get told that some believe. That Paul's in the synagogue, he's preaching, he's teaching, and some believe. I don't want to discredit this moment. I don't want to discredit his time in Thessalonica. Some believe. And then we see that there's a bunch of these Greeks, these non-Jewish people that are believing, and that there seems to be a movement beginning to stir. And then what happens? A riot takes place. These Jews are upset with him. They begin to try to stop what he's doing, and so a riot takes place. I love the word that Luke has to use here. He says that they begin to gather this mob, and the adjective he uses is he just says, they're wicked. They're wicked men. I have nothing other to tell you other than they're wicked. They're about the most despicable people you can think of. And this mob gets formed and all havoc breaks loose. Christianity for a long time has not been popular, and it's actually been very costly, to the point where this guy Jason in Thessalonica, his home appears to be kind of a centerpiece in Thessalonica for Christian work to happen. People kind of know him to be one of the players in the city when it comes to this Jesus movement. And so when they're looking for Paul and they can't find Paul, we know that he's got a relationship with Paul, because when they can't find him, he's guilty by association. Hey, you're the guy that kind of hangs with him. You're going to know where he is. And so they run to Jason's house. They begin to wreak havoc on the house, and then they begin to beat up Jason, and they begin to take his household, and they bring him before the city authorities. But he's not in trouble because of his association just with Paul. Because there's a bigger culprit here. There's a bigger issue than Paul. It's Jesus. He's not getting brought before these authorities because of Paul. He's getting brought before these authorities because of Jesus. They hate Jason because of Jesus. Let's be clear. It's not because of Paul. It's because of Jesus. And Jesus told us this would happen. Didn't he? He said, if they hated me, they're going to hate you also. And so this week when I began to see the stuff going on about Christians in Afghanistan, part of me, I'm shocked. Or I'm surprised. I hate this, but there was a part of me that I was surprised. And that shock factor comes right because we're in the Western world and we've never even close to tasted a hint of that kind of persecution. But as you begin to watch it and you begin to get shocked, but then you look back at the word, you're just like, okay, why am I shocked here? I should totally be sad. I should totally be upset. All those are right and good. We're supposed to care for the body. When one of us hurts, all of us hurt. But the surprise, why are we surprised? Weren't we told persecution was going to come because of his namesake? And so when we see persecution happening because of his association with Jesus, we shouldn't be surprised. And my prayer for us is that we will always have religious liberties and freedoms, and that will never be in danger. My prayer is that if the day comes here in the West where we do face danger, God will give us strength and that we would be ready. Not shocked, not surprised, but ready. And so this persecution comes in, and we know that this isn't because of Paul, this is because of Jesus. And we know that because when Jesus comes into your life and he calls you to him, he draws a line in the sand. And he says, you're either with me or against me. We don't have commonality with the things of the world. And so we have an enemy. You see, Jason didn't get attacked by this mob because he had a friend named Paul. Jason got attacked by this mob because he had a friend named Paul who was trying to tell everybody about Jesus. That's the association. And we see that in our text, and we'll get there in a moment. We know Paul's trying to tell everybody about Jesus. But then we know, Jason gets brought before these city authorities, and the qualm is that Jason has been allowing those guys, those guys who've turned the world upside down, who began to make a ruckus, he's allowed them in. They've come to our city, they're here, and they've been welcomed with open arms. They're chilling at the household of Jason. A few weeks back, I mentioned this passage. I said I love that phrase, to be turned upside down. They turn the world upside down, because what it literally means is it means to flip on its back and shake. And I just said, hey, I hope for us, I hope for you, that when life is all said and done, you can leave here saying, I shook some things up. that we didn't play it safe. That a few weeks ago at that clinic, the police did show up. That's awesome. We're shaking some things up, and we're not doing it in a way, we're not berating women, we're there to say, hey, how can I help? That's it. But it's shaking the world up because the world doesn't want this help. And so Jason, he's allowed these people who flipped this world upside down and began to shake it. And when they get to Thessalonica, the Thessalonians aren't happy about it. And as the Jews are making this appeal to the city authorities, right? Because they've laid these brothers before them. They've said their piece. They're saying that the world is getting flipped upside down. Look at what they attribute it to. Because they're going against the decrees of Caesar, and then they're saying that there's another king, one called Jesus. It's not Paul. It's because Paul is associated with the real culprit, Jesus. The reason for all the animosity. How does Thessalonica respond to the message of Jesus? With anger. We don't want it. Get it out of here. I do love how the story ends, though. It was humorous to me almost that this detail gets added, because I don't get why you would add this detail, but it's literally like, so Jason posted bond and then they were all released. It's like, Luke, why are you adding that detail? I don't get it, but it's kind of cool that he mentions that bond was posted and they got on their way. Maybe you don't think that's cool. I thought it was fascinating. Look at our next part of our text, picking back up in verse 10. Paul's obviously caused a riot and there's a problem, and so he's dipping. Verse 10, the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea, and when they arrived, they went to the Jewish synagogue. Now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. Not hard to do. They received the word in all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see these things were so. Many of them therefore believed, with not a few Greek women of high standing as well as men. So the next city we see is Berea, right? And then we see that Paul does what he has been doing by custom. He shows up in the synagogue and he's reasoning. But there's a stark difference here. These aren't the same kind of Jews that he ran into in Thessalonica. And it says that they were noble, they were more level-headed, there was good dialogue here. They weren't in stark opposition to what Paul was saying. In fact, it actually says, no, they were hungry for this. Like Paul's in here, and they're all ears, and they say, hey, we want to hear what you're saying, we want to know what you're saying, like explain that more. You know what I love what happens next? You know what I love about our text in Berea? Why I like the Bereans? Is because they heard what Paul was teaching. And they didn't just take it for face value. They went back to their scriptures and they were examining, okay, is what he's saying true? Is what he's saying true? Because I have a high calling on my life. Like being in this pulpit, speaking the word of God to you, my theology's got to be pretty straight. Because there's a lot of warnings about guys who mess up in here speaking. And so I never want to come up here and lead anyone astray, because I know the warnings. I know those passages like the back of my head. But you as well. You haven't been called into consumerism Christianity. We're not trying to create fat theological slobs on Sunday mornings here. I don't want you just going, yeah, this is really good. He's kind of funny sometimes, but that's not what I want. I want you to be able to hear and motivate you to go back to the scriptures and have the Holy Spirit teach you in a very real way. Because at the end of the day, you're not going to stand before the King of the universe and think, I'm responsible for what you believed. At the end of the day, you're going to be responsible for what you believed. You won't get up there and say, well, you should know all the teachers who've influenced my theology, and that's why I have an excuse for believing wrongly. That won't be the case. I can teach, hopefully motivate, but the Spirit's going to teach you. And you need to be in his word. And you need to feast on it yourselves. One of my favorite questions that I get every once in a while on a Sunday is, hey, Tyler, what do you mean by that? Can you explain yourself a little further? Because sometimes I only have 40 minutes up here, and I go quick, and I'll say things, and I say it with a mindset, hey, I know all this other stuff, but I'll say a quick statement and go. Move on to the next thing. And so if you can come and say, what do you mean by that? Because I look here, and I don't understand. Can you explain it more? Because there seems to maybe to be a contradiction here. And there's a way to do that. There's a way to say, hey, I help me here, or, let's talk about this, not, Tyler, you're dumb. This is why you're wrong. I wouldn't go that route, but maybe just saying, hey, let's have a conversation, because real fruit can come from that, for both you and for me. And so those questions, those conversations are some of my favorite. And this is a radically different response than what happened in Thessalonica. Still Jews, same scriptures, but different responses. We don't control the outcome. We're just called to be faithful into presenting. And these brains begin to soak up this teaching, and they grow more in love with the scriptures. And then what happens? Look back with me at Acts 17, starting verse 13. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, they came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. Then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. Those same people from Thessalonica that started the riot, that got the wicked men, they're saying, hey, there's something happening over in Berea. Let's get over there. Let's stop that movement. And I'm just picturing the Apostle Paul for a moment thinking, goodness gracious, can I just catch a break? I'm just trying to be faithful. I'm just trying to preach the gospel. And it seems like everywhere I go, people are chasing me down. But then I think about his story. I mean, he needs to anticipate this, right? He was the one who was in Jerusalem hearing about things going on in Damascus and says, hey, what do I got to do? I got to go run and chase it and make it my mission to stop it. And so he's familiar with this kind of reaction. He's familiar with how people react to the gospel. But now he's just on the other side of things. And this God has just a way of humbling people, of teaching them, And he told Paul all the things he was going to suffer through Ananias. And so Paul's experiencing this, probably hoping to wish he could just get some rest, but also being reminded of, hey, this is how the world responds to the gospel. And so because he's a wanted man and he's on the move again, Paul gets brought to Athens. As we already talked about, it's a very sophisticated culture, known for its affluence, its intellect, its poetry, its athletics. This was a place of prominence in just about every aspect of the word and every aspect of the world. Look back with me at our text when we look at his first moments in Athens. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with Jews and devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, hey, what does this babbler wish to say? Others said he seems to be a preacher of the foreign divinities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting, for you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, that what these things mean. Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So Paul gets brought to this new city. He gets brought to Athens, and right away that we see he gets this provoking in spirit. But he's not moving right away. He's not rushing to begin preaching the gospel. Why? Because it says that he's waiting for Silas and Timothy. He's waiting for his crew to show up. But then he gets provoked in spirit. He begins to walk around the town, and he sees all these idols. He sees all these foreign gods, and he sees all this false worship. And I think he just gets, that moment in his spirit, he's like thinking, man, how can I just walk around and look at all this and not get involved? How can I not begin to start ministering? Like, time is of the essence here. It's probably only going to be a matter of time until they get mad at me, try and beat me up and kill me or imprison me, So time's of the essence here. And so he's provoked in spirit, and what does he do? He says, okay, I can't wait any longer, and he starts ministering. To anyone that would hear. He's like, hey, I'm going to be in the synagogues, but if I'm in the marketplace, if someone's willing to hear, I'm willing to talk. And so he starts sharing the gospel to anyone and everyone who will listen. And look back with me at verse 18, because it says some of his audience was willing to converse with him. And we get two types of people that are willing to converse with him. You have the Epicureans and the Stoics. Now, the Epicureans, they pursued pleasure. It was the chief end of man was to just be happy and enjoy pleasure and live a life of comfort and with little difficulty. And this was the aim. You know, they didn't deny the existence of God, but they didn't really believe that had anything to do with humanity. And so Paul converses with these people. And I just think about, we preached about it last week, but there's about a month that has transpired when Paul's in Athens and when he was in Philippi. But I just begin to think about it. He's talking to these people who have pursued pleasure, and they think this is the chief end, that it's just about accumulating things and being happy. I got to imagine he's thinking about Lydia. I got to imagine he's thinking about this woman who experienced the highest forms of pleasure, that chased everything that this world had to offer, and yet she still needed something to satisfy her soul. She still needed Jesus. And so I'm sure he was like, hey, I love that you guys want to be happy. That's not a bad thing. But I'm telling you, if you're thinking that you're going to find your happiness in food or in sex, I'm telling you, you're chasing these things that are never really going to satisfy your soul. And I've seen it. I've witnessed it. And hey, there was those ancient texts. We call them Ecclesiastes. Solomon chased all the pleasures of the world, and he couldn't find satisfaction for his soul. And so I'm telling you, you're going to chase all these things, but they're never going to be enough. But Jesus can satisfy you. I got to imagine that's the conversing with the Epicureans. And then you had the Stoics. These were pantheists who had a great emphasis on morality, a high sense of duty. They actually believed it would be better to die by suicide than live a life that didn't have dignity. You might as well kill yourself. Stoics believed that everything was God and God was in everything. So they believed all things were good, whether they were good or evil, were from God, and that nothing should be resisted. They believed there was no particular direction or destiny of mankind. I have to imagine that Paul was conversing with the Stoics in the way of, hey, I was raised to be the next high priest. I was raised in a high sense of morality. I was the Hebrew of Hebrews, the Pharisee of Pharisees. I was tribe of Benjamin. According to the law, blameless. And all my good, all it was, just condemned me to hell. You see, because I had an encounter with Jesus. And if these were my bartering chips, my good morality, my being a good person, my all this stuff, and he's like, that's all good and right, and we should, be moral people. Surely we're not encouraging people to be immoral. But all of it, when it comes to currency for salvation, is viewed as dirty rags. They're not bad things. They're just not meant for your access to God. And so you need someone to be your good, and his name was Jesus. The spotless, sinless lamb, the sacrifice for the sins of the world. And he can be your Savior too. Think about this, he's interacting with these two very different types of people. And though Paul was able to converse with these philosophers, some of them really rejected him. Some of them began to mock him. Hey, what does this babbler want to say? They begin to think that he's dumb. And doesn't our society do that? Treating him like he doesn't have intellect. Like we've been painted as the Ned Flanders of the world. Right? That we're just so out there, and that we don't possess thought or reason. We're looked at as loons, but you can't read Romans and think Paul is anything short of intelligent. I get confused when I read. I'm like, dude, you are just on a different wavelength here. But though some mocked, there was a spark of curiosity. Though they thought what he was saying was ludicrous, they wanted to bring him before the Areopagus, the highest courts of the land, to be able to say, hey, what are you saying? It's strange. We've never heard anything like that. That you're saying there was a guy who laid in a tomb and that there was a spirit inside of him that raised him from the dead? Tell us more. I know more about that. And Paul's going to give an explanation, arguably his greatest sermon in the book of Acts, on Mars Hill. next week. And it'll be powerful. But he has these intellects, these mockers who want to know. We never heard this before. Curiosity was spiked. There was a question. So you see people respond in anger. You see people respond in curiosity. But then you also look at the Bereans and you look at people who've responded with their lives being changed forever. You never know what faithful gospel witnessing is going to bring. Can't tell you that you can go out and witness and that everything is going to go exactly how you thought. The Bible is filled with grimy stories of people that we never thought would give their lives to Jesus and do. But it's also filled with stories of people that were moral, who had things going for them, and that we thought would give their lives to Jesus but don't. Story of the rich young ruler has everything, and he says he wants salvation. Hey, what more do I need to be saved? And Jesus says, hey, go sell all you have, give to the poor, and then come follow me. And he can't do it because money owned him. He didn't own his money. He couldn't give away something he didn't have. And so Jesus was showing him he had a different master. And he leaves sad. And there's maybe some of you in here today that maybe you never made a decision to follow Jesus. I can't make that for you. But I can tell you it was the best decision of my life that I've ever made, was following Jesus. And life hasn't always been easy, and it hasn't always been fun, but he's always been near, and he's never far away. And he can change you forever. And you don't have to trust me. You can look at an ancient text that's changed lives for millennia. Let me pray.